For the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'd like to give you some lessons we have learned from bringing digital health initiatives to the field in Europe. And before I actually go into the lessons learned, I'd like to make the bridge between population health technology and Europe, actually. And you may know that Europe has an aging population problem. And what you see here on the slide on the left side is our population pyramid for the EU 27, the member states of the European Union. And what you see in solid color is actually the status in 2019. And what you see overlaid there in the bordered way is what it is expected to be in 2050. Now, as you see, our population pyramid is actually already a population onion and is set to actually change back to a pyramid, but one that sits on its head, which is obviously a big problem in terms of the aging population. So we do have that problem very much. With that comes obviously the chronic disease burden. And you see that on the right side. Excuse me. You see that on the right side. You see the self-reported long-standing illness or health problems that people have by age class. And you see that from 65 years on, people get more and more problems. And in some cases, like in Cyprus, you see that they get obviously up to 100% of the people in the age class having some sort of a chronic disease. And it's the typical things, it's the typical usual cancer, respiratory diseases, it's sort of cardiovascular diseases, all the non-communicable diseases that people get at age. So obviously we do have a problem in Europe. And the question is, can technology help? And how can technology help? Now, if you think about it, there's a lot of expectations about technology along the entire patient pathway, starting with prevention, going into diagnostics, going into treatment of people, and then, if unavoidable, going into all the way of chronic care management. There's big expectations that digital will help there. Digital will help in different areas, like in connectivity. Think about remote patient management, patient is living back home, telehealth, telemedicine. It will help in better insights in diseases. Think about all the AI and all about the data analytics tools. On the level of the individual, that's a question of longevity and of quality of life. And on the level of the population, which is the interesting question here, it is the health outcomes of the population of the whole group of people. So we want to actually see a situation where through digital health technologies, you have less hospitalizations, you have less people going to care homes where they could still live a very good quality life back home if they would have the right technologies to support them to do so. You want to have less diagnostic areas, you want errors, you want to have more targeted and precision medicine and treatments. So that's the promise of digital health. Now, has that happened? I think there is a lot going on and a lot of very positive things going on and a lot of good successes with population health and in the support of digital technology. But there have been some digital initiatives that have not lived up to the expectations. And what I'd like to give you here are the situation when digital expectations meet the healthcare reality, as I called it, lessons I've learned from various initiatives and projects in the field, where you actually may want to pay attention to certain things to really make sure that the whole thing becomes a reality. And in the 5 areas here, that's where I have sorted them. There's adoption and behavioral issues when people don't use the digital technologies or they don't use them according to the intended way of being used and they don't realize the intended results. Then there is the big question of economics of digital health. You need to make digital health somehow viable. The question essentially being who pays for it and what does he get out of it? How do you make sure that there is really an impact on the population health level? Then there is legal and ethical questions. Obviously, we work about data and we work with patient data, which is very sensitive data. So there is questions of data protection. There's questions of informed consent, for example. Regulatory is a big area of concern because all regulatory bodies around the world are trying to somehow keep up with the digital pace and to bring out regulations to regulate obviously what we are doing with the digital technologies. But that's a very difficult feat given how fast digital really moves on. And then there are technology challenges. People always think now there is the age of cloud and open source software, but there is still a lot of challenges in terms of technology, most notably in terms of the data that you want to process and the quality of the data. Now, going into them one by one, one of the first lessons I learned, that's the adoption and the behavioral challenges, is to design with a focus on the real benefits of the users. The real is the most important point here. What you see on the right side here is the opportunity, which I said before, along the entire patient pathway. There is a lot of different opportunities to bring digital health to the patient and to do things with the patient. I was personally involved in building a chronic care management platform for multiple sclerosis patients some years ago. And there was a very interesting environment to learn a lot about how to do and how not to do technology. And the idea was that we would give the patients some wearables, and they could actually on a mobile phone or on a web browser fill out patient-reported outcomes measurements questionnaires, and could give more information about their status when they were not in the hospital, but they were back home. And in principle, I think a good idea, but already with that, you have not only the patient using that application, but you have on the other side the care team, you have the treating physicians. So you have a lot of people that need to use that tool, and they all need to have some sort of a benefit, and they all need to invest some effort into the whole thing. And here was one of our first problems. We couldn't connect to the electronic health record system of the hospital for a variety of reasons. And with that, there was a redundant entry of data, which was a complete no-go for the care team. They said, look, we have enough work to do. We cannot duplicate all the data, even though it wasn't so much. It was an initial effort to set up the care plan, but then it was essentially in every intervention to just add a few values. And that was already one thing that didn't work out. They clearly saw that the effort to use that solution by far exceeded the benefit that they had not to have to look it up in the EHR and 2-3 other systems, but to have it all in one system. We had as well incorrect assumptions about how the clinical reality would work there. We had fairly inexpensive wearable devices, Fitbits and other things where you could get information back. And that was certainly interesting. How many steps had the patients done? Had he slept well? And from the patient-reported outcomes, you would see is there depression or anything. But the problem with that was that is not really what the neurologist wanted to have. The neurologist said, what I really need is gait. How does that person walk? Is it like, is the person starting to already move a little bit funny because he's losing control? Does he have actually problems in neurology? That is what is really important for me. And that was much more difficult to get. Alert fatigue was another problem, where we sent nudges to the patient to remind him of medication, to remind him to take his walk, to do certain things. And patients, specifically the recently diagnosed young patients that live in a state of denial and don't want to hear anything about that disease, get permanently reminded of the disease. So they absolutely didn't want to have that. Add on that user reservations. I want to speak to the patient, to the doctor, and not to some mobile application. Doubts, does it really work? Does it really help me? And the typical resistance to change. And you can imagine how difficult it can be if you don't have a real strong benefit for the user. In the end, this chronic care management platform never saw the light of the day of reality. We actually stopped during the pilot for many other reasons. A second area that is, I think, very important is to have a very clear and evidenced value proposition for the customer. The question here is really who pays? And you have always 5 different payers, so if you want, that can bring in the money. It can be the patient through out-of-pocket payments, can be a payer through a reimbursement, it can be the provider if you have a business case that works for the provider, for a healthcare institution, for example, cost saving. It can be an employer that comes then down to the patient, but it's not the patient paying out of pocket, it's the employer paying for him. Or it can be research institutions and like pharma companies, for example, that would buy the data. The problem is, in Europe at least, patients don't really like to pay. They pay for some medications, but for digital health, it's a very, very difficult sell to get. The providers very often don't have a sensible business case that would work, where you could really save cost, or where you could bring in the money that it would cost to have a digital health application. Quality is not really anything that would work for a business case, because we still have payment by procedure. Pay for procedure and not pay for quality. And for the payers, there is limited reimbursements for digital health at that point in time, and the reimbursements for telehealth that were all opened up during COVID are mostly temporary and currently are just simply expiring. An interesting example is the German DiGA, the digitale Gesundheitsanwendung, digital health applications. That's a law that was passed last year in Germany in 2019, 2 years ago already. It essentially gives people the possibility to get a reimbursement for digital health applications. That's what you see on the right side here on that infograph. The left part of it shows you what the criteria are for digital health applications. So you have to have a low risk medical device, which means class 1 or class 2A. Europe has 4 classes, class 1, 2A, 2B, and then 3. That's the lower risk medical devices. Needs to be based on digital technologies and needs to be for monitoring, detection, relief, treatment of illnesses, disabilities, injuries. And then you need to get into a register, which is maintained by what is called here the BfArM, which is the abbreviation for the German Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices. And they are maintaining that registry. And when you have that, you can actually, with an approval of the health insurer or with the prescription of the treating physician, get a reimbursement. What is important here, when it gets in the register, there's an assessment happening by our Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices. And it's about safety, functionality, quality, data protection, and so on. But it's above all about positive effects on care. Now, you may enter in that register when you have not yet proven the positive effects on care. Then you get a testing period of up to 12 months where you have to bring proof of that having positive effects on care. It's not as strict as a clinical trial for a pharma company, let's say, but it still has very sensible requirements how you would want to prove the effectiveness. It's not sufficient to have some anecdotes, so you have to certainly bring a clinical investigation. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's not anything that would be impossible. Otherwise, the 12 months wouldn't really be sufficient. This has been very interesting first step in Germany. In the register, you have currently, I counted them yesterday, 20 applications, out of which 3 are already permanent. And I have the status of late August. They had, I think, 80 or 85 applications for the register. So it seems to be successful. It is still very new. It is still just going out. There's still a lot of open questions. But one interesting thing was the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has just last week said that he wants to copy and paste the German DiGA into the French system. So that's sort of a confirmation that we are doing things sort of hopefully right. A third area was legal and ethical considerations. And the question here is to build on trust and then draw on the benefits from the legal requirements. What I mean by that is, the problem again is that you have very sensitive healthcare data, patient data that people are really careful about. People may share a lot of things on social media, but they don't share necessarily the health data, and they're typically very careful on who can get the health data, at least in bigger amounts. They are very careful about that. And specifically in Europe, people are very buttoned up about healthcare data, which is quite understandable. The trick here is to ensure the protection of that data and the protection of the interests of that patient, while at the same time enabling the perfectly legitimate and beneficial use of the data for that patient, but at the same time for the bigger population, learning from the data of that patient to see what we can learn in terms of like the population perspective. The ethical challenges, by the way, are very closely related to the legal challenges. For example, informed consent. We have in the GDPR a specific stipulation about how an informed consent has to look like and what it has to contain. So that's actually not separate. It's really like 2 brothers, if you like, that belong together. Just for the sake of completeness, because we have these situations, there is IP questions about AI and then the machine learning solutions. Specifically, as a provider, you build an algorithm, and then in a hospital setting, the hospital uses their data to build that model and to have the trained model. And the question is, whose algorithm is that, and how does that work out? And there is a question about liability of AI recommendations. Because different to a normal application where you build the application and you bring it out to the hospital, in AI and machine learning, you build an application, you build an algorithm, and then you train it with data. And the ones that bring in the data and that annotate the data and then maintain and curate the data may be different people, but that may be a source of problems. So the liability for AI recommendations is not always perfectly clear, and that's a big debate in legal circles as well. My example here is the European General Data Protection Regulation, and I'm sure you have heard about that in Singapore. It is a sort of a big thing here in Europe. It was a big thing to introduce it. GDPR, as it is abbreviated, has two main objectives. The first one was about harmonizing the EU-wide legislation, and the second was to provide strong rights for the individual. About the harmonization of the EU-wide legislation, the point was before the GDPR came around, we had the DPD, the Data Protection Directive. And the directive under European law is essentially a call for the national governments to have local law, national laws that they need to put into practice, which meant that they all had different laws, different philosophies, different penalties, different approaches, different ways of putting what was asked from the directive into practice, which led to very different legislation in the 27 EU member states. The data protection regulation is different. The regulation in European law gets out and is directly applicable for the entire EU member state, the 27 member states. Nobody needs to do anything on the local level. Even though on the local level, there is some additional stipulations that are put in there for the regulation. You can't change it completely, but you can certainly put a lot of local flavor. That's why I have written down here mostly harmonized EU-wide legislation. In large parts it is, in some parts it is not harmonized because there is still local flavor to the GDPR. The strong rights for the individual, you see them here on the right of access to rectification, to erasure, to be forgotten, if you like, to restrict processing and so on. There's an interesting one about the right to be forgotten. If you think about the big AI machine learning algorithms, they typically are built with the data of hundreds, rather thousands of patients, of subjects, data subjects. And with that, you have actually the problem that if you want to forget anyone from that, you have to retrain these algorithms. And that sounds like a minor problem, but it is actually a very big one. If you think about databases like, for example, the UK Biobank, where tens of thousands of patient data have been used to write hundreds, if not thousands, of research reports. They have been used for hundreds, if not thousands, of data algorithms, data-driven algorithms. It's very, very difficult to get the data out of here. So that right to erasure faces some actually very thorny implementation problems. In general, I think GDPR is a success. It's a remarkable, interesting success, but it has been seen as very complex and restrictive. And I think that is certainly a point. There is always that fine balance between overshooting on the one hand, but at the same time having something which is not just a paper tiger and which really brings some reality to the field. Why did I say draw on the legal requirements? Actually, the GDPR protects us in Europe, and that is a way where we have to really, live up to this legislation, and people are very careful about it. So the typical tech giant approach to get data and to sell data to some advertisers doesn't really work. So in that sense, it's actually something that is not so bad for us, medtechs and pharmas and so on, doing our business and not being trusted by people actually taking the data of patients away. Data is the new oil, as they say, and trust is the currency in which it is paid out. It needs to be legal. So I think in the end, there is actually a few very positive sides to the GDPR. In terms of regulatory, scaling globally means living with global regulatory variety. The problem that the regulators have around the world, and Europe is no exception there, is to keep up with that digital transformation, with the speed with which there is new things coming out, and securing the regulatory intentions, which is safety, quality of the medical devices or the pharmaceutical products, and obviously the clinical performance. And the two main challenges I think they have is, on the one hand, they need to build the competences to really know about digital technologies and digital approaches in the regulatory bodies, and they don't have the people necessarily that can do these things, because it's not just about knowing about AI, it's about knowing about AI, it's about knowing about regulatory procedures and approaches, and it's about knowing the clinical context. And people that unite these three knowledge pieces are actually quite rare to come around. So that is a problem that takes them a while to build it up. And at the same time, they have a lack of real world experience. We are trying to regulate things as they move ahead and as they come into the market and as we see what it really is. So by necessity, regulators are actually behind the track and are just simply trying to somehow stay up to date there. Now, the example I have here is regulation of medical machine learning. The FDA has actually made a very nice discussion paper there. The problem here is, if you think about machine learning, there's many different variations about that, but locked machine learning models are models which you train once and then you put them in the field and they just work that way. On the other hand, continuous learning or adaptive models, as you see here on the right, are the models which learn permanently. And since big AI algorithms get the better, the more good data you have there and the more accurate, you actually want to make sure that they learn and they get actually much better in moving ahead. The problem with that is that only locked machine learning models are today something that you can bring to the market because you have to re-qualify, to recertify an algorithm once you change it, once you change that algorithm. So in continuous learning, you would need to permanently re-qualify that algorithm. Now, the FDA has recognized that problem and has put out a proposal, it's not yet decided, that if you stay with the intended use, let's say you have a chest X-ray or a chest CT algorithm for AI-based imaging analysis, and you don't change the intended use, you just make modifications that relate to performance or to algorithm input, then you don't need a new clearance. If you change the intended use, let's say you add in the algorithm a way of having incidental findings like a measurement of the aorta, then you would need a new clearance. That will help with continuous learning if it gets decided. Now, here's how Europe has gone about it. And the problem is that we have different regulatory philosophies across the different regions. There's a proposed EU AI regulation. Again, regulation applies to the entire European Union. It has just been put out and it is not yet enacted, so that will take years to come, but it's very comprehensive and very far-reaching. Europe has taken a risk-tiered approach to regulating AI. There is, as you see up here, the unacceptable risk systems that you can't do at all. There's the high-risk systems, and then there's the limited and minimal risk AI systems. Pretty much everything that is in the medical domain falls in the high-risk AI systems. And that has very high requirements. You have to have an ex-ante conformity assessment. You have post-market monitoring requirements. So it's very difficult to bring such algorithms out to the field. We're not even talking anywhere about the details of the machine learning in the sense of medical machine learning, as I said, just with the FDA, where there's already solutions to thorny issues with continuous learning. What's even more, the AI regulation that has been proposed there is overlapping with the medical device regulation, the MDR here, for example, in the quality and conformity assessments. So it looks like that is going to be a very bureaucratic effort. Now, on the upside, if you look at the AI regulation there, you see a lot of answers to all the questions that have been posed by AI algorithms in the last 2 years. You see a lot of the abuse, the problems they have tried to take into the regulation. Whether it will happen that way is an open question. If you take GDPR was proposed in 2012. Was put into law in 2016 and was enacted in 2018. So from proposal to really being a law that applies to people was 6 years. I'm not sure how long the AI regulation will take, but the interesting point is it came out and we have already first discussions with customers that want to see our perspective about that. So it's something which is on the minds of people, and we have to live with different regulations in different global areas, where we have to make sure that our solutions that we want to scale globally somehow fit to all the different needs. Last but not least, I want to say a word about the technology context in the medical domain. To be very realistic about that, people always think now we have these cloud solutions and we have open source software. Everything is so easy, everything works very nicely. But the reality is actually the medical environment is a very complex domain. We're not after the common colds. We're after very complicated diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, oncology. These things are very, very complex, and that drives the complexity of solutions. And one of the problems I have seen there is that sometimes it's very, very difficult to come out with a minimum viable product in the first step that would be good enough that it has an impact, that it really can make a change and it can actually have a benefit, but at the same time is not so complicated and so comprehensive that you don't even get it implemented anymore. The bigger problem, however, is very much about data. And the problem being there that not only is it sensitive data, that's all the legal and regulatory questions and the ethical questions, but it's actually typically spread out in many different systems. It's not necessarily the quality you need. It's very often very different semantic in different systems. It doesn't really mean the same things. So just getting the data and preparing the data is a lot of effort. There's a rule of thumb that people say that 80% of your effort is in acquiring and cleaning and preparing and integrating the data, and 20% is actually in using the good data to make some interesting algorithms and do something about it. The example I have here is the AI applications that were all built during the COVID-19 crisis. I'm sure that was the same in Singapore as well. Hundreds of tools were developed in a very, very short amount of time. People rushed out to build these applications. And some of them went into clinical context, which is good. But there was several reviews, scientific papers even, which looked at these tools, and it turned out that a lot of these tools, the majority, the by far majority, were actually not fit for clinical use. And that were issues with poor quality of data, bad application of machine learning, poor reproducibility. People couldn't really go back to show that it really works in bigger contexts, bias in study design, all these things. I think one of the biggest challenges that we saw there was that the people that were supposed to actually help with making sure that the medical context is right, the data is really right in medical context, were so busy with treating patients that they have absolutely no time to help anyone with the data. Whereas the people that built the algorithms that would have maybe had the statistical tools to correct the errors just didn't know the medical context. So there was a little bit of a lack of being able to collaborate and to prepare the data appropriately. Summary and recommendations. I think digital health has an enormous potential to increase efficiency and quality, and I think there is a way of pushing population health forward on the population level. That said, healthcare is a complex environment, and there's a lot of very difficult challenges for digital solutions. The corona pandemic, I think, has accelerated the digital transformation. We see a new level of openness, specifically in Europe, to telehealth, to telemedicine, digital therapeutics, and all these things. But it has not solved all the challenges. So the 5 points I just showed you are pretty much there still despite corona, and they still need solutions. I think personally, very close collaboration, multidisciplinary collaboration between technology and healthcare providers, technology providers and healthcare providers is a very, very important point to move on with the digital solutions beyond the pilots. I have heard many people complain we have more pilots than any big airline has pilots, and that's probably true. But we need to get beyond the pilots and really scale them in clinical routine, because only then, when we can scale them in clinical routine and bring them out in various institutions, is there really an impact on population health? And coming back to the European situation, only if we have that at scale will we be able to really change the problems that we have there and to make sure that we can still have our healthcare system up and running. I think building trust, educating patients and healthcare providers is a very critical ingredient to overcome the reservations and fears. And last not least, I think regulatory and government agencies definitely have a very critical role to play, because they really put up the legal and economical frameworks in which digital health unfolds. And they have all the interest in making sure that it is not only a very interesting thing for technology providers making money, but obviously for making sure that there is a dent into that problem of population health, the challenges of the chronic disease burden. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry for running a little bit over time, I believe, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Thomas, for the really insightful sharing. Unfortunately, the rich sharing really has left us not much time, and the session actually is going to be concluding soon. So we have no time for Q&As, but really you're sharing on the EU experience around digital health, its potentials and potential applications to Singapore, and some of the key regulatory and data protection challenges that definitely we have things to learn from Europe side. Were some of my key takeaways from the session. For everyone in the audience, we have now come to the close of the session. Thank you again, Thomas, for the insightful sharing. And thank you everyone for participating in this segment.